As the night deepened, the stars above began to shimmer brighter, their ancient light reflecting off the still surface of the lake. The moon, a pale guardian in the vast sky, cast its soft glow over the landscape, painting the world in shades of silver. Hercules remained by the water's edge, a man at peace, no longer the hero of legends, but simply a traveler, someone who had learned the profound quiet of existence. His thoughts, once chaotic and filled with the relentless echoes of past battles, now swirled gently, like leaves caught in a breeze. He thought of the path that had brought him here, the countless challenges he had faced, the enemies he had defeated, the victories that had once defined him. And yet, in this moment, it was not the battles that filled his heart. It was the stillness, the acceptance, and the quiet joy of simply being. He could feel the weight of his past lifting off his shoulders, not because he had forgotten it, but because he had come to terms with it. The legends, the tales told in his name, were no longer his to carry. He had walked the path of strength and glory, but now he had found something more valuable, a peace that transcended everything he had once believed. The world continued around him, the gentle hum of nature surrounding him like a lullaby. The breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, the water lapped softly at the shore, and the sounds of the night filled the air. In this harmony, Hercules felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for his victories, nor for the challenges he had overcome, but for the quiet moments of clarity, for the understanding that life was not about conquest, but about connection. He looked up at the stars, feeling a deep, profound sense of belonging. He was part of the universe, as vast and unknowable as it was, but in this moment, he felt at peace with it all. No longer bound by expectations, no longer chasing after some distant ideal, he had found his place. As the night stretched on, Hercules leaned back against a nearby rock, his eyes closing for the final time that evening. His breath, slow and steady, matched the rhythm of the world around him. And with that, a final, soft smile graced his lips. There was nothing more to seek, no more journeys to take. In this moment he had arrived, and the story of Hercules, the hero, the legend, had finally found its peaceful end. And so, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the great hero closed his eyes and slept. And then, as the fog began to recede, the hounds slowly vanished into the darkness, one by one, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own breathing. The forest once again was silent, but the feeling lingered, the weight of the hound's eyes on him, the knowledge that something far greater than he could comprehend had passed through this place. Hercules stood alone, his sword lowered, his heart still racing, unsure of what had just happened. The lesson the hound had left him with, a reminder of the past, of the souls that never rest, hung heavy in the night air. And yet, despite the darkness, despite the lingering sense of ancient power, Hercules felt an odd sense of peace, the kind that comes from facing the unknown and surviving. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe. And in that brief, quiet moment, he felt as though the weight of his trials had lifted, if only for a second. But that peace was fleeting, for in the distance, the sound of a howl broke the silence. And Hercules knew, deep down, that his journey was far from over. The howl echoed through the forest, sharp and piercing, its mournful cry cutting through the stillness like a blade. Hercules froze, the sound vibrating in his bones, sending a fresh wave of dread through him. It was not the hound's usual growl, not the threat of its teeth and claws. This was something different, something that made the air grow heavier. The trees seemed to lean closer. Hercules' hand tightened around his sword, his heart pounding once again in his chest. He strained his ears, trying to decipher the direction of the cry, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fog, which had begun to lift, rolled back in, thick and oppressive, wrapping around him like a living thing. The moon, once bright and full, was now obscured, the night growing darker with every passing moment. And then the earth shifted beneath his feet, more violently this time. The ground seemed to tremble, as if the very foundations of the forest were breaking apart. Hercules stumbled, his balance faltering as the world around him distorted, the trees swaying unnaturally. He could hear a strange, guttural sound, almost like a chant, rising from deep within the earth, vibrating in his chest. It was a voice, no, many voices, speaking in a language older than time itself, murmuring secrets from the depths of the underworld. And then, as if the fog itself had come alive, something massive stirred within it. A shape, dark and enormous, began to emerge slowly, its movements impossibly fluid, as though it were rising from the very soil. Hercules' breath caught in his throat. It was another figure, a being he could not quite comprehend, something far beyond the hounds of Hades. A shadow, taller than any man, draped in black, its form shifting and flickering, like smoke caught in a cruel wind. Its eyes, glowing red and fierce, locked onto Hercules, and a wave of pure terror washed over him. This was no creature to be slain with sword or might. This was something far older, far more powerful, a force that had lived long before even the gods had walked the earth. Hercules could feel it now, its ancient presence closing in, suffocating him, drowning him in the weight of its gaze. The world seemed to tilt, the ground tilting with it as he fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sensation of 1,000 unseen eyes upon him. He gasped for air, his throat constricting, but the mist grew denser, colder. The forest had vanished, replaced by an endless abyss of darkness, and in that abyss, the towering shadow loomed. The voices grew louder, chanting, their words wrapping around him like chains, pulling him deeper into the unknown. With trembling hands, Hercules reached for his sword, but it felt distant, like a memory from another life. He could no longer remember how to fight, how to resist. The ancient power before him was too great, too overwhelming. But then, amidst the fear and chaos, a faint sound pierced through, so faint he almost didn't hear it. A whisper, soft like the rustle of leaves. "Your courage is your shield." Hercules blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of the words. The voice had come from within him, a reminder of something forgotten, something that had always been with him. His breath steadied as the fog began to dissipate, just enough to allow him to see clearly again. The towering shadow still loomed, but its presence felt less suffocating now, less overwhelming. Hercules raised his head, his shoulders straightening, as a spark of something ancient ignited within him. The courage that had carried him through every trial, every battle, flared within his chest. He could fight this. He could face the unknown. With newfound resolve, he stood tall once more, his grip firm around his sword. The voices quieted, the dark shadow faltering, as if the very force of his determination had begun to push back against it. The ancient being's red eyes flickered, narrowing as it regarded him, perhaps for the first time seeing him as something more than a mere mortal. And then, with a movement that was almost imperceptible, the creature withdrew, sinking back into the mist from which it had come. The fog, too, began to recede, revealing the forest once more, the twisted trees and eerie shadows now nothing more than distant memories. Hercules stood alone, his heart still racing, but the fear was gone. The weight of the encounter remained, but he knew now that he had faced something beyond himself and survived. The night was still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The stillness of the night pressed in around him, the heavy silence settling like a blanket over the forest. Hercules stood in the midst of it, his heart still pounding, his breath shallow. He could feel the remnants of the ancient power in the air, like a faint echo of something that had almost consumed him. The creatures of the underworld had withdrawn, but their presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. His sword, still gripped tightly in his hand, felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the weight of the encounter. Hercules looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, every dark corner of the forest, but nothing moved. The fog had vanished completely, and the moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting long, thin beams across the forest floor. For a moment, it felt as though everything had returned to normal, as though the terror of the last few moments had never happened. But he knew better than that. He could still feel the pull of the abyss, the way it had threatened to swallow him whole. And yet, despite the lingering unease, there was something else, something faint but undeniable. A sense of peace, a quiet calm that seemed to settle over him like the first rays of dawn after a long, stormy night. Hercules took a deep breath, steadying himself, and finally let his sword fall to his side. The weight of his trials had never felt so real, so present as it did now. And yet, there was a quiet understanding in him, a realization that he had faced something beyond the physical world, something deeper, older, something that could not be fought with brute strength alone. He had felt it, that ancient sorrow, that deep sadness that existed in the spaces between the living and the dead. The Hound of Hades had not been his enemy, nor had the shadow. They were echoes of a forgotten past, reminders of a realm that had once been alive, but now lingered in the depths of the underworld. And Hercules, though immortal, had been allowed to witness it, had been tested by it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, Hercules felt a sense of connection to the world around him. The trees, the earth, the moon, everything was part of something much larger, something beyond his understanding. He wasn't just the son of Zeus, a hero who had conquered monsters and gods alike. In this moment, he was just another traveler, standing on the edge of an unknown world, caught between the living and the dead. And that thought, strangely, comforted him. For he realized that no matter how many trials he faced, how many battles he fought, there would always be forces beyond his control, beyond his understanding. All he could do was face them as he always had, with courage and strength. And so, as the night stretched on, Hercules walked deeper into the forest, the shadows of the past still hovering close, but no longer holding him captive. The forest seemed to open up before him, the trees parting slightly as though guiding him toward some unseen destination. There was a quiet peace in the air now, a serenity that had once felt unattainable. For the first time, Hercules realized that peace did not always come from victory, but sometimes from understanding, from accepting the things beyond his reach. And so he walked, step by step, into the unknown, ready for whatever the next chapter of his journey might bring. The Hound of Hades, the Shadow, and the voices of the ancient underworld were behind him now. But their lesson would stay with him forever. Sometimes, the greatest victory was simply finding the strength to keep going. The path ahead stretched out before Hercules, a winding trail that seemed to disappear into the dense forest. The air was cool and fresh now, the oppressive weight of the previous encounter lifting with each step. He could still feel the strange energy lingering in the woods, but it no longer felt threatening. Instead, it was as if the very essence of the forest had accepted him, as though it had witnessed his courage and had granted him passage into its depths. The trees no longer seemed to loom over him. They stood tall, like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering in the wind, offering him quiet companionship. With each breath, he felt the tension in his muscles begin to loosen, the weight of his sword growing lighter in his grip. The world around him felt different now, as if time itself had slowed, allowing him to truly experience each moment as it came. He could hear the soft rustle of leaves beneath his boots, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft gurgle of a stream nearby. It was a peaceful night, one that promised solace for the weary soul. Hercules allowed himself to slow his pace, taking a moment to enjoy the calm after the storm. His mind drifted, remembering the trials he had faced, the many battles he had fought. But this was different. For once, there was no urgency, no fear of what might come next. There was only the now. As he walked, he glanced up at the moon, still shining brightly in the sky, its pale light casting a soft glow across the forest floor. A gentle breeze stirred the branches above, and he paused, letting the cool air wash over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of the world around him. The earth beneath his feet, the rustle of the leaves, the distant cry of an owl, it all felt so natural, so alive. He wondered how many others had walked this path before him, and how many would walk it after him. The thought of time stretching on, of the endless cycles of life and death, made him feel both small and vast at once. He could feel the weight of his own existence in that moment, the legacy of his trials, his victories, and his failures. But for the first time, he felt at peace with it all. He wasn't just a hero. He was a part of something much bigger, something older than the gods themselves. And in that moment, as the cool night wrapped around him, Hercules understood that peace didn't always come from defeating monsters or winning battles. Sometimes, peace was found in simply being still, in accepting the world as it was, in letting go of the need to control everything. The path continued to unfold before him, the way forward uncertain yet inviting. And Hercules took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift, and stepped forward into whatever awaited him next. For the first time in a long while, he was ready to face it, not with the might of a hero, but with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to listen, to understand, and to move forward with open arms. The forest embraced him as he walked deeper into the unknown, and Hercules knew that he was no longer alone. As Hercules moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night seemed to wrap around him like a soft, familiar melody. The rustling leaves whispered tales of old, of heroes and legends, of struggles long past and wisdom gained through hardship. His footsteps were steady now, the ground beneath his boots firm and unyielding, as though the earth itself was guiding him forward. The air, once cold and heavy with the presence of ancient creatures, had transformed into something fresh, invigorating. It was as if the forest had accepted him, acknowledging his journey and offering him a moment of respite. The path wound upward, climbing gently toward a small hill. The trees began to thin, their branches parting slightly to reveal a breathtaking view. In the distance, the outline of a distant mountain range stood tall, its peaks bathed in the faint glow of the moon. Hercules paused, standing at the top of the hill and gazing out at the landscape. A sense of awe filled him as he took in the vastness of the world before him. The land stretched far and wide, rolling hills, dense forests, and shimmering rivers all blending into one endless, peaceful horizon. The night was quiet, save for the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. For the first time in his life, Hercules felt small, not in a way that made him insignificant, but in a way that reminded him how immense the world truly was. He had spent his life fighting, battling monsters, gods, and the very forces of nature itself. But now, standing in the quiet of the night, he realized that the greatest victories weren't always found in the clash of weapons or the roar of combat. The world was vast, full of beauty and danger in equal measure. But it was also full of moments like this, moments of stillness, where everything seemed to pause and one could simply breathe and take in the world for what it was. As he stood there, lost in the serenity of the landscape, he felt something deep within him stir, a realization that he had been seeking peace in the wrong places. The strength he had relied on, the battles he had fought, had always been external. But peace, true peace, was found within. The sounds of the forest, the cold touch of the wind against his skin, the moonlit sky above, these were the things that would carry him forward. Not the wars, not the struggles, but the quiet moments, the stillness that allowed him to reflect, to understand, to grow. Hercules took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. The wind seemed to carry a message, one that had been waiting for him to hear. The journey ahead wasn't one of endless battles. It wasn't about conquering monsters or proving his strength. It was about walking forward with purpose, embracing the unknown with a heart open to whatever came his way. And in that moment, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with both challenges and peace, with moments of great difficulty and moments of quiet grace. But he was ready for it all. He opened his eyes, his gaze lifting to the mountains once more. With a final, steadying breath, Hercules turned, stepping away from the hill and continuing down the path. For now, he had nothing to fight. No monsters to slay, no gods to challenge. Just the quiet promise of whatever the journey would bring. And that, for the first time, felt like enough. As Hercules walked on, The moonlight continued to guide his steps, casting long shadows that danced on the forest floor. The night felt endless, stretching before him like an open canvas, waiting to be filled with new experiences, new lessons. The air was crisp, but not cold, gentle, like a soft embrace, reminding him that even the harshest of trials eventually gave way to peace. The path ahead was still, but there was a subtle hum in the air, a vibration that stirred something deep within him. It wasn't the restlessness of a new enemy or the pulse of impending danger. It was something quieter, something more profound. He could feel the pulse of the earth beneath him, steady and constant, as though it were breathing alongside him. His thoughts drifted again, this time to the lessons he had learned from his journey thus far. The battles he had fought, the monsters he had slain, the gods he had challenged, they had all shaped him, forged him into a hero of legend. Yet, as he stood here now, he realized how much of his strength had been born from his ability to embrace the quiet moments, the moments of vulnerability. He thought back to the Hound of Hades, to the eerie presence in the fog, and how, at first, he had believed they were enemies to be fought. But in the end, they were simply reminders of things much older than him, forces of nature, creatures bound by ancient sorrow, perhaps even reflections of his own struggles. The world, it seemed, was not just a place of clear-cut victories and defeats. It was full of contradictions, filled with things both dark and light, and it was this balance that made it whole. Hercules had been part of that balance for so long, fighting on one side of it, as though he had to win every battle, conquer every foe. But now, as he walked through the quiet forest, he realized that the true victory wasn't in defeating those forces, but in understanding them. The faint sound of water trickling in the distance brought him back to the present moment. He followed the sound, the path leading him through a thicket of trees and towards a small, winding stream. The water was clear, its surface glinting with moonlight. He knelt down beside it, dipping his hand into the cool flow. For a brief moment, it was as if the entire world had narrowed to just this, the gentle splash of water, the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze, the stillness of the night. His fingers brushed the stones beneath the water's surface, and it occurred to him that this stream had been flowing long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. It was a humbling thought. Hercules stood, wiping the water from his hands, and glanced up at the sky once more. The stars were scattered across the heavens, twinkling softly, as if each one held a secret of its own. He felt small in their presence, insignificant, perhaps, in the grand expanse of the universe, but at the same time, he felt deeply connected, as though his existence was a thread woven into the fabric of everything around him. The wind picked up again, gently brushing through his hair. It was as if the world itself was urging him forward, telling him that there was still more to see, more to learn. And so, without hesitation, Hercules took another step, his feet carrying him further into the forest, further into the night. He didn't know what lay ahead, what challenges or triumphs awaited him. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. For he had learned, in the depths of the underworld and in the silence of this ancient forest, that peace wasn't something that could be fought for. It was something that could only be embraced. And with each step he took, he embraced the journey more fully, trusting that the path ahead, whatever it may be, was exactly where he was meant to be. Hercules continued down the path, the quiet solitude of the forest embracing him with each step. The air had a certain weight to it now, as if the very trees around him held their breath, waiting for something. But what? He could feel it, a subtle pull, as though the forest itself was calling to him, urging him to move forward, to leave behind the familiar and step into something more profound. The moon, still high in the sky, bathed the world in its soft, silver glow. The shadows around him deepened as he walked, but they no longer felt threatening. The night seemed to wrap around him like a cloak, comforting him in ways words could not express. For so long, his existence had been defined by battles, by moments of chaos and violence. But here, in this quiet space between the living and the dead, Hercules was beginning to realize that there was another kind of power, one born of stillness, of patience, of simply being present in the moment. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night grew richer. The chirping of crickets, the distant rustling of leaves, the call of owls, it all blended together into a soothing rhythm, a heartbeat of the earth itself. Hercules found himself slowing, his steps becoming lighter, as if he were moving in harmony with the world around him. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glow, shimmering softly through the trees. It wasn't the harsh light of a torch or the burning flames of a fire. No, this was something else, gentler, like the soft radiance of a distant star, beckoning him toward it. Without thinking, he found himself walking toward it, drawn in by its warmth, its quiet brilliance. The closer he got, the clearer it became, a small clearing in the heart of the forest, illuminated by the light of a single, glowing flower. It stood in the center of the clearing, its petals radiating a soft, ethereal light, casting delicate shadows on the ground around it. The air in the clearing was thick with the scent of something sweet, almost intoxicating, like a flower that had bloomed only for this moment, for him. Hercules paused at the edge of the clearing, a sense of reverence washing over him. He had fought gods, monsters, and beasts, but nothing had ever felt quite like this, a moment of pure wonder, a rare gift from the world itself. He approached the flower slowly, each step deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile peace of the moment. As he knelt before it, he felt a strange warmth fill his chest, a deep sense of connection to the world around him. For all the battles he had fought, all the scars he carried, this simple, quiet beauty was the truest thing he had ever encountered. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the flower, feeling its warmth radiating in the cool night air. He didn't touch it, not yet. He was afraid that if he did, this moment, this fragile, perfect moment, would slip away, like a dream fading at dawn. But the flower seemed to beckon him, as if inviting him to partake in its gift, to become part of its quiet light. The urge to reach out, to feel it, was overwhelming. With a deep breath, Hercules extended his hand and gently touched the glowing petals. The moment his fingers made contact, a sudden rush of warmth spread through him, flooding his body with a sensation he couldn't fully describe. It was as if the flower was sharing its energy, its peace, its ancient wisdom with him. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the connection between him and this mysterious flower. In that instant, everything made sense. The battles, the challenges, the struggles of his life, they had all led him here to this moment. Not for glory, not for fame, but for something far deeper, something beyond the reach of even the gods. He had fought to protect the world, to fight for justice, for honor. But here, in this quiet corner of the earth, he understood that the greatest battle was not against enemies or monsters. It was against his own fears, his own doubts. The flower pulsed gently under his fingers, and Hercules felt a deep, resonant peace fill his soul. It was the kind of peace that could only come from surrender, surrendering to the flow of the world, to the rhythms of nature, to the understanding that life was not about conquering or fighting, but about embracing and flowing with it. He sat back, his hands still resting near the flower, and let the moment wash over him. The fear that had once gripped him, the sense of urgency, began to dissipate. All that remained was the quiet joy of simply existing, of being a part of this vast, mysterious world. For the first time, he felt truly at home. And as he sat there in the clearing, the flowers' glow casting a soft halo around him, Hercules realized that the greatest journey was not one of battles or conquests. It was the journey within, the journey to find peace, to let go of fear, and to embrace the quiet beauty that was always around him, if only he had the courage to see it. The path ahead was still unknown, but for now, he was exactly where he needed to be. The night stretched on, and Hercules remained in the clearing, his heart heavy with the quiet understanding that had washed over him. The flower's glow had dimmed slightly, but it still radiated a soft, comforting light. It was as if it had shared its secrets with him, its ancient wisdom passed from its roots into his very being. For a long moment, he simply sat there, letting the cool night air embrace him, the soft sounds of the forest whispering all around. The stillness was profound. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a perfect equilibrium. Hercules slowly stood, his body reluctant to leave the peace of the clearing, but something inside him urged him forward. There was no need to linger in this one moment, no need to cling to the comfort it provided. It had given him what he needed, a deep peace, an understanding that the greatest strength didn't come from the sword, but from the heart. He stepped back from the flower, his fingers still tingling from the brief touch. As he turned to leave the clearing, something caught his eye. At the very edge of the trees, just beyond the soft light of the flower, he saw a figure standing silently, watching him. It was not a figure of malice or danger. No, this was different. The figure was tall, shrouded in a cloak of shadow, but there was something familiar about the way it stood, something comforting in its presence. Hercules felt his heart skip a beat, his warrior instincts momentarily flaring. But instead of fear, he felt a deep sense of recognition. This was no enemy, no threat from the underworld. This figure was a guide, perhaps, or something that had been waiting for him. He took a step closer, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword, but his body felt no tension. The figure did not move, did not speak. It simply stood, waiting. The air around them seemed to pulse with something ancient, something that neither of them needed to name. Hercules felt the weight of time itself in that moment, the years of his life, the battles he had fought, the lessons he had learned. This was not a place for words. It was a place for understanding. The figure, still shrouded in darkness, took a step forward, just enough for the moonlight to catch its face. Hercules froze. It was not a face he had ever seen, not one that could be placed among any mortal or divine being. It was a mask of the ages, its features a mix of both ancient wisdom and deep sorrow. Eyes that gleamed with both kindness and the sorrow of centuries past. In that fleeting moment, Hercules understood. The figure was not here to speak of the past, but to remind him of something even more important, the knowledge that, despite all the battles, despite all the victories and losses, there would always be things that were beyond his control. The figure smiled, a gesture both reassuring and mysterious, and with that smile, something in the air shifted. The moment was no longer heavy with the burden of understanding. Instead, it was filled with quiet acceptance. Hercules didn't speak, didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. The figure simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say, "You've learned what you needed. Now it is time to continue." And with that, the figure stepped back into the shadows of the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence in the air. Hercules stood there for a moment longer, his mind swirling with the depth of what had just occurred. He had expected his journey to be one of constant action, of relentless battles and endless trials. But what he had encountered in the heart of the forest, in the clearing with the glowing flower and the mysterious figure, had taught him something entirely different. Peace, it seemed, was not a destination or a victory to be earned. It was a way of being, a quiet acceptance of what was and what could be. Hercules turned back to the path, his footsteps slow, but sure. The forest was still, as it had been when he first arrived, but now it felt less like a place of mystery and more like a part of him, something familiar. The stars overhead, the moonlight filtering through the branches, and the gentle rustling of the leaves were no longer just elements of nature. They were reflections of his own heart, of the journey he had undertaken to understand the balance of life. As he walked, he felt no fear, no urgency. There was no longer a need to rush toward the next challenge, the next trial. He had learned that some journeys had no destination, only the path itself, one step in front of the other, toward whatever the future may hold. And so, with quiet resolve, Hercules continued on, leaving the clearing behind, embracing the vast unknown before him. No longer seeking, but accepting. No longer fighting, but living. The night stretched ahead, but Hercules knew now that he was ready for whatever it would bring. He was no longer the hero of legend, the slayer of beasts, the conqueror of gods. He was simply a traveler on a path, one that would never truly end. As Hercules walked, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots was the only sound that accompanied him. The quiet seemed to have deepened, as though the forest itself had settled into a tranquil slumber, leaving him to ponder the lessons of the night. Each step he took felt lighter than the last, his body still strong, but his mind no longer burdened by the weight of past battles or future expectations. The journey ahead seemed endless, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He wasn't searching for something anymore, not for a fight, not for glory, not for approval. He was simply walking, allowing the path to unfold before him. The stars above twinkled like ancient guides, their light soft and distant, a reminder of how small yet significant he was in the grand scheme of things. The soft rustling of the trees in the wind, the calls of nocturnal creatures, the scent of earth and fresh air. It all felt like a melody, a natural harmony that resonated deep within him. The peace he had found in the forest, the stillness he had embraced, had opened something inside him that he hadn't known existed. There was no longer a need to prove himself to anyone, no longer a need to fight for recognition or chase after accolades. He thought back to the moment in the clearing when the flower had glowed softly beneath his fingers, and the mysterious figure had smiled at him. It had been an invitation, an acknowledgement of something greater than his own strength. It was a reminder that even the mightiest of heroes could find peace not in victory, but in acceptance. The figure had been right. The battles he had fought, the challenges he had faced, had all led him to this moment where the greatest test wasn't of his physical strength, but of his ability to surrender, to accept the world as it was and find peace within it. The path ahead now seemed open, not just physically, but emotionally. He didn't feel the weight of expectation, the pressure to live up to a legacy or a name. He simply felt the freedom of being himself, of existing in the world as it was, with no need for justification. As the night wore on, the trees began to thin, and the path ahead started to open up into a wider, more open space. The air felt different here, warmer, as though the sun's presence lingered even in the darkness. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a horizon, the first hints of dawn beginning to spread across the sky. For the first time in his life, Hercules didn't feel the need to rush toward it. There was no urgency to greet the coming day. It was simply another moment in the endless flow of time, one that would come whether he was ready or not. The forest, the journey, the path, all of it had given him the gift of understanding. And with that understanding, he knew that the world didn't need him to be anything other than what he already was. As he walked toward the horizon, toward the first light of the new day, Hercules felt a quiet smile tug at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace with the man he had become and with the world that had shaped him. There were still paths to walk, still challenges to face, but they no longer felt like burdens to carry. Instead, they felt like opportunities to grow, to learn, and to embrace whatever came next. The road ahead was still unknown, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he was walking it, step by step, with the peace he had found deep within his heart. And with each step, Hercules knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, as if the earth itself were waking from a long, peaceful slumber. Hercules stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sun's rays stretch over the land, casting long shadows behind him. The forest, still quiet, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of contentment, as though it, too, had found peace in the stillness of the night. For a moment, he simply stood there, absorbing the beauty of the dawn. It was a quiet, unspoken reminder that life moved in cycles, darkness followed by light, quiet followed by noise, peace followed by chaos, and that none of these were permanent. Everything came and went, flowing like the river he had crossed earlier. The only constant was change. Hercules took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the world around him. He could feel the earth beneath his feet, solid and grounding, reminding him that he was a part of something much larger than himself. He had often sought power in the form of strength, in battles won and enemies vanquished. But now, standing in the quiet glow of dawn, he understood that true power came from within. It came from the acceptance of the world and oneself, from learning to move through life with grace and patience. The wind picked up again, a soft breeze that rustled the leaves and carried the fresh scent of earth and pine. It whispered secrets in his ear, as though the forest itself was telling him stories of those who had walked these paths before him, of heroes and legends long forgotten. Yet he realized their stories were not so different from his own. They, too, had sought meaning, sought peace, and ultimately had to learn to embrace the world as it was, with all its beauty and imperfection. The path ahead, now bathed in the golden light of dawn, was still uncertain, but it no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh chapter in a journey that had taken him through darkness and light, through moments of doubt and moments of clarity. Hercules smiled softly to himself. He wasn't the same man who had entered the forest all those hours ago. He had changed, not in his strength, not in his abilities, but in his understanding of what truly mattered. He had learned that peace wasn't something to be fought for or earned. It was something to be accepted, something to be embraced with open arms. The wind picked up again, this time tugging gently at his cloak, as if urging him to move forward. And so, without hesitation, Hercules took his first step away from the forest and into the world beyond. The journey ahead was still vast, but with each step he took, he felt lighter, freer. He no longer carried the weight of expectations, no longer sought the validation of others. He had found peace, not in victory, but in acceptance, and that was all he needed. As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the earth in its warm glow, Hercules continued on his way. He didn't know where the road would lead, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. For the first time, he felt truly alive. And in that moment, he understood his journey had only just begun. As Hercules moved forward, each step felt more deliberate, as though the very ground beneath him was affirming his choice. The path wound through a meadow now, where the tall grass swayed gently in the morning breeze, catching the light like strands of gold. The world seemed to shimmer with possibility, as if the dawn itself was a promise of renewal, of growth, and of quiet moments waiting to be discovered. The air was crisp, the scent of fresh dew mingling with the earthy fragrance of the forest. Hercules took a deep breath, savoring the sensation. He had spent so much of his life in a rush, always striving, always pushing forward with the weight of expectation on his shoulders. But now, there was a new rhythm to his steps, a natural cadence that mirrored the pulse of the earth itself. In the distance, he could hear the soft gurgling of a stream, its waters laughing as they flowed over rocks. It was a sound he had often heard in his travels, but today it held a different meaning. It wasn't the sound of rushing water, of a journey that needed to be completed, but of a flow that could not be stopped. A reminder that life, like the stream, would continue, whether he was ready or not. But now he was no longer fighting the current. He was moving with it. He approached the stream and knelt down beside it, dipping his fingers into the cool water. The sensation was grounding, like the touch of the earth itself, and for a moment, he let his mind wander. He thought of the battles he had fought, the triumphs, the losses. He thought of the countless faces he had encountered along his path, some familiar, some strange. And through it all, he had been searching for something beyond the strength of his muscles, beyond the victories that had won. Now it was clear. He had been searching for peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of it. Not the silence of the world, but the quiet within himself. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the meadow, Hercules felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude. For the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of strength, not the ability to defeat enemies, but the ability to stand still, to listen, to let the world unfold around him without the need to control it. A gentle breeze blew through the meadow again, rustling the leaves, and in its whisper, Hercules heard the faintest echoes of a voice he couldn't quite place, but one that resonated deep within his soul. It was as though the earth itself was speaking to him, telling him that he was where he needed to be. He stood up, his hand lingering for a moment on the smooth stones of the stream, before he took a step back onto the path. It was clear now that there was no need to chase after anything, no need to prove anything. He had already found what he was searching for. And as he walked, the world seemed to shift around him, as though acknowledging his newfound peace. The trees swayed, the birds sang louder, and the sun warmed his face. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had changed. His heart had lightened, and with it, the weight of the world seemed to lift. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Hercules was not afraid. He no longer felt the pressure of destiny bearing down on him. He wasn't searching for glory or seeking to be remembered in songs and stories. He was simply walking, moving through the world with a quiet understanding that the true journey lay not in the places he visited, but in the moments he experienced, in the peace he found within himself. The sound of the stream faded behind him as he continued forward, the meadow now a distant memory. But the peace he had found there, by the water's edge, remained with him. He had learned that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones you don't seek. And sometimes the most profound moments are the ones that are silent, still, and unspoken. With the sun now fully risen, Hercules walked into the future with open arms. The path was long, but the burden was light. For he had found, in the quiet of the night and the gentle flow of the stream, a peace that would carry him through whatever lay ahead. The day stretched out before Hercules like an endless expanse, and with each step, the burden that had once seemed so heavy seemed to ease even further. The world, bathed in golden light, felt like a dream, a world that no longer demanded anything from him, a world that no longer expected him to fight or prove his worth. It simply was. He walked through valleys and climbed hills, the sky shifting from the soft blues of morning to the deepening hues of afternoon. The wind whispered in his ears, not with urgency, but with a sense of quiet reverence, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath, waiting for him to finally see it. The further he walked, the more he felt his old self, the one defined by battles and feats, slipping away. It was not a loss. It was a release. The strength he had once sought in the roaring of his enemies, in the clash of swords, now seemed insignificant compared to the peace that had settled in his heart. He no longer needed to wear the weight of glory as a shield or carry the pride of past victories like a banner. He passed through small villages, where people greeted him with warmth, their faces familiar in the way one recognizes a long-lost friend, but there was no fanfare, no cries of admiration. They saw him, yes, but they saw the man, not the hero. And it was a relief. Hercules continued on, not seeking validation, not seeking anyone's praise. His journey now was not about reaching a destination. It was simply about living, about being present in the moment, about letting life unfold around him without the need to control it. As dusk approached and the sky turned a deep violet, Hercules stopped at the edge of a quiet lake. The water mirrored the fading light of the sky, rippling gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in a long while, he sat down by the shore, not with the restlessness he had once known, but with a quiet acceptance of the now. He wasn't rushing to conquer anything. He was simply breathing. The stars began to twinkle overhead, and a peaceful silence settled around him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the soft ripple of water against the shore. It was in that silence that he understood, more deeply than ever before, that there was no final battle to win. The only victory that truly mattered was the one within, accepting the flow of life, embracing its twists and turns, and knowing that, in the end, peace was the greatest strength of all. With a soft sigh, Hercules closed his eyes, feeling the coolness of the evening settle in. There was no need to go anywhere, no need to chase after anything. He had arrived. He had found his place, his peace. And as he sat by the lake, surrounded by the quiet hum of the world, Hercules knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey, it seemed, had already come full circle, and he was finally home. As the night deepened, the stars above began to shimmer brighter, their ancient light reflecting off the still surface of the lake. The moon, a pale guardian in the vast sky, cast its soft glow over the landscape, painting the world in shades of silver. Hercules remained by the water's edge, a man at peace, no longer the hero of legends, but simply a traveler, someone who had learned the profound quiet of existence. His thoughts, once chaotic and filled with the relentless echoes of past battles, now swirled gently, like leaves caught in a breeze. He thought of the path that had brought him here, the countless challenges he had faced, the enemies he had defeated, the victories that had once defined him. And yet, in this moment, it was not the battles that filled his heart. It was the stillness, the acceptance, and the quiet joy of simply being. He could feel the weight of his past lifting off his shoulders, not because he had forgotten it, but because he had come to terms with it. The legends, the tales told in his name, were no longer his to carry. He had walked the path of strength and glory, but now he had found something more valuable, a peace that transcended everything he had once believed. The world continued around him, the gentle hum of nature surrounding him like a lullaby. The breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, the water lapped softly at the shore, and the sounds of the night filled the air. In this harmony, Hercules felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for his victories, nor for the challenges he had overcome, but for the quiet moments of clarity, for the understanding that life was not about conquest, but about connection. He looked up at the stars, feeling a deep, profound sense of belonging. He was part of the universe, as vast and unknowable as it was, but in this moment, he felt at peace with it all. No longer bound by expectations, No longer chasing after some distant ideal, he had found his place. As the night stretched on, Hercules leaned back against a nearby rock, his eyes closing for the final time that evening. His breath, slow and steady, matched the rhythm of the world around him. And with that, a final, soft smile graced his lips. There was nothing more to seek, no more journeys to take. In this moment, he had arrived. And the story of Hercules, the hero, the legend, had finally found its peaceful end. And so, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the great hero closed his eyes and slept.